Venus flytraps are one of these plants that as a kid really captured my imagination. The whole idea that a plant would seek out and capture and eat little bugs was really cool to me. Obviously that's not quite how they work, but they're still a really cool plant. So having the opportunity to build a terrarium with these plants was a no-brainer. Flytraps are native to boglands, where the soil has very little nutrients, hence the need to capture bugs. So the terrarium I need to make needs to replicate this. So with that in mind, let's get scaping. This terrarium won't be sealed, so having a large opening at the top is just fine, and I have plenty of room to work with to recreate a bog environment. For the substrate, I went with a fine lava stone. This will provide good drainage and more importantly is inert. Flytraps are really sensitive to extra minerals and nutrients in the soil and water, so I need to avoid that where possible. I needed to add enough substrate to allow water to pool at the bottom. Flytraps like to grow their roots down to just about the water level, so there needs to be enough substrate to allow the water to pool while still supporting the rest of the terrarium. And of course, after adding, it needs flattened down. The next step is the same with any terrarium, the barrier layer. I measured the mesh screen by placing the terrarium on top of the mesh and cutting around it with a craft knife. This is simply to ensure that none of the soil and plants get washed down into the substrate layer. The next important layer in this terrarium is going to be sphagnum moss. In most terrariums, this is where you place down your charcoal, but sphagnum moss is going to replace that role in a bog terrarium. It will help soak up the water and absorb any extra nutrients that may be in the soil. And speaking of water, it is vitally important to use the right type of water with Venus flytraps. You need to use either rainwater or distilled water. Regular tap water will end up killing your flytraps. In this case, I'm using distilled water. I'm going to add it to the sphagnum moss just to start weighing things down. And now for the soil. A Venus flytrap requires very specific low nutrient type of soil. In this case, it's peat moss. This soil is perfect for recreating the bog environment and is exactly what the flytrap needs. I'm going to mix the peat moss with the red lava stones. This is the same as any other terrarium. Mixing the soil with other components increases aeration, avoids clumping and allows for better water management. I could have also included sphagnum moss in this mix, but because I already had a layer, I didn't feel the need to. I'm making my mix in about 3 parts peat moss to 1 part lava stone, and then just making sure it's mixed thoroughly together. When it came to adding the soil, I didn't have to worry about mixing the layers. Both the sphagnum moss and the peat moss would work well together to create this bog-like environment. I added soil until it covered the sphagnum moss, but was still deep enough to plant the Venus flytraps, and it gave me a little extra to scape with. I used my scaping tool to level out the soil to get an idea of how much I had to work with. After smoothing it down and seeing how much room I still had in the terrarium, I decided to add a little extra. It didn't need much, just enough to make sure I had even amounts all round. With everything in place, it was finally time for the flytraps. These flytraps came in a nice bed of pink cushion moss and I wanted to keep that. One of them also came with a nice surprise. Growing beside it is a very young spoonleaf sundew, another carnivorous plant. I hadn't originally noticed it until after the terrarium was complete, but we'll keep an eye on it as it grows. But firstly, we need to remove the flytraps from their pots. Obviously, because I want to keep the pink cushion moss and avoid stressing out the flytrap too much, I'm only going to remove about half of the soil it's in, only seeking to expose the lower half of its roots. The soil it has arrived in also seems to be made up of peat moss and perlite, which is just fine to go straight into the terrarium. At this point, I still wasn't sure how I wanted the scape to look, so I decided just to plant all 3 flytraps and just see how things looked. When planting them, I made sure that the holes were deep enough for the roots to reach the water level, but other than that, I just needed to see how they looked in the terrarium. The first attempt was fine, but I felt it needed just a few adjustments. I felt that I needed to make more space around each plant and maybe vary the elevation just a bit. I left the front plant where it was and went ahead with removing the back 2. Making use of the leftover soil the flytraps it came with, I could make adjustments to the height. I then replanted the flytraps, but making sure I left space between each one. The small changes to the spacing and elevation gave more definition to each island. It also allowed me to make room for other small bits of scaping. For the scaping, I decided I wanted to keep it simple. The main focus should be on the fly traps. Using a rehydrated sphagnum moss to cover up the soil really brought up the contrast between the islands and the rest of the terrarium. The pincushion moss beds really stand out in amongst it, and hopefully as the fly traps continue to grow, they'll really get to show themselves off. I used some wooden branches to scatter around the terrarium. These would help break up the mosses while also giving it a look of a natural bog environment. I scattered them around just where it felt natural to their shape and making use of the gap in the middle. I had some leftover mosses from another project that I thought worked well in this terrarium. They helped add a little bit more variety to the terrarium and helped fill in any gaps that hadn't been covered yet. And then it was just a matter of final adjustments. Adding in any extra mosses, making sure any of the soil wasn't visible, rearranging any twigs, and making sure everything was properly seated. The idea behind this terrarium was always to keep it simple. I wanted it to remain looking natural, somewhere that fly traps would naturally be growing. While I could have added larger decorative pieces, the fly traps are still small and I wanted the focus to be on them. So for now, I'm just going to keep it as is. Perhaps in the future when they've grown, we can revisit it. But before we can call this terrarium finished, there's a few final touches. Firstly, we need to water it again. Being an open terrarium, this will need to be watered every so often, especially because Venus flytraps love the sun. So this will be sitting in the sunniest place I can find. The final touch is simply cleaning the glass. I wiped down the inside with a paper towel just to remove any moisture or dirt, and then went round the outside with a microfiber cloth. Overall, this has been a very simple terrarium build. With the exception of the plants themselves, there's nothing too special in this terrarium. But the Venus flytrap is such an interesting plant and I really can't wait to watch it grow. Especially because we have the addition of that sundown. So make sure you're subscribed and following the channel for any updates on how it grows. But until then, thank you for joining me on Lifescape Nooks, and until next time, stay creative and keep scaping.